Tonight, a dangerous illusion collapsed. Not slowly, not gradually, but all at once. In a single day, the idea that this war could be paused through diplomacy was exposed as fiction. What happened was not a failed negotiation. It was a power move, calculated, humiliating, and unmistakable. Moscow did not hesitate. It rejected peace outright. And in doing so, it sent a message the world could no longer ignore. When that message landed, Washington didn't blink. Strategy shifted in hours, not speeches. But the real shock came next. Kyiv did not wait for instructions. Ukraine did not accept being managed. It spoke for itself, and it drew a line. If you want to understand how wars truly escalate, how pressure replaces dialogue, how resolve replaces restraint, stay with me, because what you witnessed today was not a moment, it was a signal. And to understand that signal, we must first understand what was really being offered and why it was never meant to succeed. To understand what broke today, we need to be precise about what was actually on the table. This was not a grand peace plan. It was a ceasefire framework, limited, conditional, and deliberately pragmatic. Its purpose was simple: stop the momentum of violence long enough to test whether diplomacy still had oxygen. From Washington's perspective, this proposal followed a familiar logic. Apply pressure, offer an off-ramp, and wait to see whether the other side signals flexibility. It was transactional, yes, but also predictable. And predictability is often what prevents wars from spiraling. But predictability only works if both sides recognize the same rules. Moscow did not. What Putin was being asked to do was not surrender territory or concede defeat. He was being asked to pause, to accept ambiguity, to leave room for a future outcome that did not validate total victory. And that, more than any clause or condition, was the real problem. Because this war has never been only about land. It has been about control over how the war ends and who gets to define that ending. That is why the rejection mattered. And that is why the silence before it was so revealing. To grasp why that silence mattered, we have to step back away from today's headlines and into the deeper mechanics of this conflict. Wars are not just fought with weapons. They are fought with timing, memory, and narrative. From the very beginning, this war has followed a familiar historical cycle. Initial shock, rapid escalation, then the long grind where costs accumulate faster than victories. In that phase, leaders face a choice: adapt or double down, compromise or harden. For Russia, adaptation would have meant accepting limits. Limits to force, limits to ambition, limits to how this story could end. But the Russian system is not built to reward limits. It is built to reward control, projection, and the appearance of inevitability. That is why pauses are dangerous for Moscow. A ceasefire freezes not just front lines, but narratives. It invites questions from elites, from institutions, from a population already under strain. History tells us this clearly. When a system depends on momentum to justify sacrifice, stopping becomes harder than continuing. Silence, in that context, is not reflection, it is preparation. And what came next was not accidental. It was the first rupture. The rupture came fast. What followed was not a counteroffer, not a demand for revisions, not even a delaying tactic. It was a clean break, a rejection so absolute that it shocked even those who expected refusal. Every condition pointed in one direction: total compliance or nothing at all. This was not negotiation, it was demonstration. By demanding full demilitarization, permanent exclusion, and formal recognition of territorial control, Moscow wasn't trying to end the war. It was trying to redefine reality, to lock in outcomes while the fighting still favored ambiguity, to win diplomatically what could not be secured decisively on the battlefield. And then, almost immediately, the pressure turned kinetic. Missiles followed statements. Infrastructure followed language. The timing was deliberate. It was meant to signal coherence, diplomacy, and force moving as one. This is what makes moments like this so dangerous. When rejection is paired with action, it removes space for misinterpretation. It forces response. And response came not with speeches, not with warnings, but with decisions that changed the equation. Because once that line was crossed, restraint stopped being stabilizing and started being costly. What we are witnessing now is the exposure of a deeper mechanism, one that often remains hidden until diplomacy fails. This war is not only about territory or security guarantees, it is about leverage inside systems that cannot admit failure. For Moscow, the rejection was not strength, it was constraint. Years of mobilization, sanctions, and battlefield losses have narrowed the range of acceptable outcomes. Any pause that does not validate sacrifice becomes dangerous. Any compromise that looks unfinished threatens internal cohesion. So the system hardens, demands escalate, options disappear. This is how conflicts become trapped. Not because peace is impossible, but because admitting limits becomes politically lethal. Washington understood this mechanism. That is why the response was not rhetorical, it was structural. By authorizing capabilities that extend reach and protect cities, the United States targeted the very assumption behind Moscow's strategy that time and pressure would eventually fracture Western resolve. This was not escalation for its own sake. It was recalibration, a signal that leverage had shifted and that rejection would not freeze the conflict on Russia's terms. And when systems collide like this, one rigid, one adaptive, the outcome is rarely immediate, but it is never neutral. The second crisis did not arrive as an announcement. It arrived as acceleration. Within hours, multiple lines moved at once. Military aid was expedited, long-delayed systems were released, decisions that had been debated for months were executed in a single day. This is how you recognize a real shift, not by what is promised, but by what is unlocked. For Moscow, this was the scenario it had tried to avoid. The rejection was meant to assert dominance, to force others to absorb humiliation quietly. Instead, it triggered momentum in the opposite direction. Capabilities, once considered too sensitive, suddenly became necessary. That speed matters. It compresses reaction time. It removes space for recalculation. And it signals something every strategist understands: the cost of delay has risen. This is the moment when wars tip not because one side wins, but because assumptions collapse. The assumption that pressure alone would exhaust support. The assumption that restraint would hold indefinitely. And as pressure mounted, another assumption quietly failed the belief that Ukraine would simply follow. Because while attention was fixed on Washington and Moscow, Kyiv was moving, and what came next changed the nature of the confrontation entirely. This is where the war stopped being abstract and became personal. Because behind every strategic pivot are people who absorb the cost. And if you are watching this from a distance, it is easy to forget what escalation actually means. It means nights without power, cities under sirens, families calculating risk in hours, not years. And yet, this was also the moment Ukraine refused to be spoken for. Instead of waiting, Kyiv acted. It coordinated. It communicated. It made clear that partnership does not mean silence, that survival does not mean submission. Ukraine did not ask for this war, but it insists on determining how it ends. If you are wondering why that matters, consider this. Wars end fastest when those who bear the cost have agency, when decisions are not imposed, but owned. This is not defiance for spectacle. It is strategy born from endurance. And if you believe that people fighting for their future should not be sidelined in negotiations about it, then pay attention, share this, stay engaged. Because what Ukraine asserted today was more than a position. It was a principle. And principles, once asserted, are difficult to reverse. The consequences did not stop at Ukraine's borders. They never do. What we are seeing now is a chain reaction across the international system. European capitals moved with a speed that would have been unthinkable months ago. Coordination replaced caution. Alignment replaced hesitation. not because the risks disappeared, but because inaction became the greater risk. This matters far beyond this war. The security architecture built after World War II rests on a fragile assumption that borders cannot be changed by force without consequence. When that assumption is tested, every allied capital recalculates its own vulnerability. For countries watching from the periphery, this moment is instructional. It signals whether commitments hold under pressure, whether unity survives coercion, whether adaptation can outpace disruption. And this is why Moscow's move was so consequential. It was not just a rejection of a ceasefire, it was a challenge to the credibility of collective response. The answer is now unfolding in real time. What happens next will shape not only the battlefield, but the behavior of states far from it. Because once the system responds, it does not easily return to balance. From here, the future narrows into three possible paths, and none of them are abstract. The first is restraint through recalculation. In this scenario, Moscow recognizes that rejection has hardened opposition rather than weakened it, pressure mounts, costs rise. And a return to negotiation becomes not a concession, but a necessity. This is the least dramatic outcome and, historically, the rarest. The second path is managed escalation. Fighting intensifies, support deepens, but both sides avoid decisions that would close the door to talks entirely. The war stretches, not because it must, but because no one is ready to accept the risks of ending it decisively. This is how conflicts endure, not through momentum, but through hesitation. The third path is the most dangerous, a frozen conflict engineered by exhaustion, not peace, not victory, just prolonged instability. Borders harden without recognition, violence flares without resolution, and an entire region lives inside permanent uncertainty. Which path emerges will depend on one thing above all else: whether leaders choose adaptability over pride. History is unforgiving on this point. Systems that cannot adjust under pressure do not stabilize. They fracture. And the choices made in the coming days will determine whether this moment becomes a pivot or a precedent. Because once futures close, reopening them is far more costly. This is the moment clarity matters most. What unfolded was not a diplomatic failure, it was a revelation. It showed us who is willing to adapt, who is willing to endure, and who is trapped by their own rigidity. Rejecting compromise did not create leverage. It created resolve. Washington demonstrated that strategy is not about pride, but adjustment. Kyiv demonstrated that alliance does not mean obedience. And together, they removed the illusion that this war could be decided over the heads of those fighting it. If you take one insight from this, let it be this: wars do not end when one side demands everything. They end when systems accept limits. And that acceptance is never abstract. It is forced by cost, by pressure, by consequence. What comes next will test endurance on all sides. But endurance, as history shows, is not passive. It is active. It is chosen. And it reshapes outcomes. If you want to understand how this phase unfolds, how power, restraint, and agency collide in real time, stay with me. Share this analysis. Follow the next chapter. Because this story is not ending. It is entering its most decisive phase yet.